When did you tune into the humanitarian standpoint, as in who are we?
A lot of that came from my grandfather. He was the person that introduced me to computing.
How do you feel as the longest established commercial miner about where zero fees is going? And are Satoshis always going to be useful?
Satoshis will always be useful. They'll always be useful because they are the denomination of Bitcoin. Bitcoins, as in Bitcoins lowercase b, as in the 2.1 million, that is not the denomination of Bitcoin. It's the 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis that are this single floating point integers that Bitcoin uses, and it just so happens to be 100 million of each creates one unit of account.
And that's what I find interesting as well about the biological statement as well. Because if you consider your body a composition of cells, each one of the cells have an image of the whole.
Yeah.
Bitcoin follows that model. I do think that zero fees, which to be honest with you, is going to be very useful for gravity and what we're planning in the short term. But I'll be lying if I said I didn't have some medium to long term concerns as to what it means for the network as a whole moving forward for Bitcoin ultimately.
Imagine Streamanity where the video itself is on chain. You're not using like an IPFS system, or you're not referencing something that is on a server somewhere else and actually just referencing the hash of that. You're actually putting the physical payload once only. So how do you then serve that data? Yeah. You can pay someone zero fee, or you can not pay anyone zero fees for the risk versus reward of the cost of actually serving that to multiple people multiple times. So if you can monetize a file or a document or video or an image multiple times, so you have all these memes that go crazy, you have a meme image or something, or a GIF or something. Technically, that image could be an NFT. And there only needs to be one version of it. When you say all the miners have multiple versions, it's not like a content delivery network. It's a much more economically viable content delivery network because there are multiple pieces in multiple places, but it's only the digest of the hash that exists. You don't physically need to put all of that information. It doesn't require to be on chain anymore. So you now have a very, very efficient content delivery network built into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So if you think of the wallet systems in Bitcoin, that is a contractual virtual electronic handshake. So it's not just payment transactions, it's payment, and you can have those payloads referenced within the wallet. So the UTXO set, or the change area in those wallet systems, that's where you'd stick your identity system. So if you have a 1 or a 0, the wallet itself is expecting a yes or a no, and it's then concatenated to the ID of every transaction that goes in there. So you can computationally override or create a second layer within the change system and say this now references on-chain identity, but it's not a 1 or a 0, it's a 2.
Yeah.
So you then have your reference index going through. So every transaction, you now have an XPub, which is your higher risk, your HD key system primarily for identity that references something for every transaction you do. So you turn that system up on its head. So instead of you logging into an application, the application sign into your wallet. You've already attested your ID. So now you have an XPub for your identity and you have an XPub for your payments, and they're tied. So you can now have, so the third limit now is how do you have that as a universal login system for every single MetaNet application? So
this links into now, is this the core first product release of your business that you're set out called Veribit, right? So is that the core? I know there's many different components to it, but would you say this is going to be the first component that you launch with?
This is the most essential. Having identity within the wallet system if you can standardize that. So I did apply to be part of the standard service for wallet development, and my first application wasn't accepted, which was a shame because I do have some ideas about the standard. Obviously, these standards, and we've got different token standards now. So you have like tokenized, and you have STAS tokens, and you have Bitcoin Computer, and you have run tokens.
What's your opinion on all the different token standards?
I think it's really interesting because you have different people playing with different methodologies, and none of them are wrong. And I can see different business commercialization ways of each token being specifically really good at certain things. So tokenized stuff, okay, you can say they're second layer, but if you look at the documentation and you look at the level of accountability that comes with it as a public company, not as a public company, but as a company to say, no, we, as any other company, we will actually attest to the frameworks that we've developed your tokens on. They can all be referenced. So you know that if you use a tokenized token system, the validity is very similar to how you would have like an ERC contracts. There will be ways that you can actually view the contract. You can view it within the tokenized backend system, and you can actually, when I contract with you, there's all various different templates. So if you're looking at a templated system that requires, especially if you're doing microtransactions, you know that the Satoshi unit, if you want to do layer 0 tokens like stats tokens, they are the ultimate. The Satoshi is the ultimate token. It's Bitcoin's native token. And if you can do that in any way you can with any application you can natively, that I would say is the preferred manner in doing things. However,
I agree.
You can't scale 21 million to the world of micro transactions or nano transactions because there'll be so many in circulation. There won't be enough to go around. So you have to start thinking of second layer ways in order to tokenize stuff. So you can see why tokenized, they have a way of doing things.
So on that, just to make sure I understand that point correctly, are you talking about Satoshi precision there? So we'll eventually get to a point where there's too much colorization of Satoshis that you're going to have a supply problem, right?
Yes.
So even though it's 10 to the power of 8, we're still going to have that issue. Yeah. I agree on that. In fact, that's something we've modeled out mathematically here at Bitstocks with our head of research, Julian. And to be honest, it's actually one of the things that I was banging on about in my conversation with Craig, which was in the background, I was looking at this type of stuff. Right? Why do you think there was an issue in computing, or why is it just below 21 million? Just from your standpoint.
If you look at the 2.1 quadrillion units of account, which is the Satoshi, I believe, if I remember rightly, it was originally 42, which is the magic number. It's the answer to everything.
Yep. Everything based off a 24-hour clock, right?
Yeah. So if you look at the doubling system, so if you look at the payload system for op push data 4, and you can see that it's the same as a DVD. If you go back to a DVDs before Blu-rays, it's 4.1, 4.2 gigabytes in size. If you look at doubling of integers in a 32 or 64-bit system, so you have things called floating point integers, which is how memory allocation is used. So if you can have a 32-bit system or a 64-bit system. So when Bitcoin was created, it was mainly run, not many 64-bit systems were out there. So if you look at the 32-bit system, it's 2 to the power of 32. So if you do the maths, you work out the numbers and you get to your 4.2 gigabytes of memory allocation, which is the limits of hard drives and memory systems. Because if you look at the types of cycles, so everything within a von Neumann architectural system within computing systems, they have clock cycles. So you have to have so many floating points per clock in order to do fast calculations. So if you have a higher clock cycle on your CPU, you have a more powerful computer because it can do faster calculations because of the timings are shorter, which is why you want shorter memory allocations on your RAM. So this is how we get information into a system as fast as possible. That is the bottleneck, the throughput of how you get information through into a system. So to answer your question about the 21 million, I think it's an arbitrary number. But the number it's not exactly 21 million for the reason of the doubling system. So if you double from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, they would normally round it up to 1 gigabyte, but it's actually 1024, 2048. and so on and so forth. So if you do the doubling system, which is the way that the clock cycles work, you actually find the answer to the question.
Nice. So, Hashwars, talk to me.
Oh, goodness me. Hashwars.
Roy, if you've been commercially mining since the beginning, how in the trenches have you got? What has that been like? And if we can actually touch on the serious aspects to this now, which is this technology is one of light, right? I think there's many reasons status quo doesn't want this light to turn on the way that we believe and know that it can turn on. So if you've been involved at the infrastructural level for as long as you have, suiting up and I guess going to battle with, I'd imagine you must have spoken to Craig quite closely in the early days, and I'd imagine moving forward. What's that been like from your perspective, being so involved since the beginning?
The whole scaling issue started, I noticed it probably early 2015. And it didn't seem like it was an issue at the time. In fact, it was so arbitrary. For me, it wasn't even part of the narrative. There was no part of the conversation. It was, as you get towards, as the average blocks get 70, 80% full most of the time, let's raise the block, let's double it. Which sounds like it is and was a really simple thing to do. You just change the number from 1 to 2. There's a couple of things you needed to do in between, but it was very, very simple way of scaling Bitcoin safely. And when I say safely, it was only because of the flood protections that were put into Bitcoin in the really, really early days. It was only necessary. And there were lots of other changes that were put in, which started to not make sense anymore. It seemed like there was a bit of a sandbox going on. There was someone playing in the sandpit, and they're saying, "What can we do with it?" And you don't know the cause and effect of what you're doing. I kept my mouth shut because I can be very opinionated, and I didn't spend a lot of time on Twitter in those days like I do now. I understood in 2017 when the fees started going up, and you think, okay, now I get it. Now I understand how miners are now competing for the fee market, not the market and the value of the transactions, but they want the block rewards to go up. That is their whole economic incentive is money go up. Let's create bottlenecks within the system. That means that if you want your transaction to go through any time today, you have to pay. This is when I started looking at going back into doing merge mining, because I'm thinking, okay, if you've got these splits between Bitcoin Cash and BTC, how can you do sawtooth mining? How can you flip from one to the other? So we started developing algorithms probably early part of 2018 to work out which was the most economical viable chain to be on at every given time, and to be able to instantly switch between one chain and the other. And that made it doubly difficult when BSV and BCH split, and then there was that whole three-way thing was really messy. I had taken my foot off the gas in terms of media because I would say that when I came out in late 2015 and put on Twitter, I know for a fact that the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto is Dr. Craig Wright. That was, I didn't realize the backlash and how awful that experience would be. So if you go back far enough, you will understand that any friend of Satoshi is marked. Marked in such a way is that the trolling.
But why? It's trolls one thing, we've seen that all online, but why? Because anyway, this guy got chased out of Australia. It's been attacked viciously. He's been kicked off social media platforms. He's been bastardized. He's been villainized. Why?
Because the systems that be, the people, I don't want to call it a cabal, but it certainly feels that way. There are powers that be that have a mutual invested interest in the companies that this VC money that has primarily come from Silicon Valley startups that is related to the monetization of industries that rely on Bitcoin not working. It was a very obvious roadblock that was put in there to create, to take value from one chain and move it either to another chain or through another third party. The whole principle of Bitcoin is that you can do stuff peer-to-peer and it's really small transactions, and you create market economies on top of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I started getting the concept of that idea probably late 2017, early 2018. And when I started talking to Craig more and more when he was still active on Twitter, I was saying I love this, going back to the Bitcoin script. I can understand that if this is set in stone, this will allow for innovation on the next layer. So let's stop messing around with the Bitcoin protocol. Let's set that in stone. Yeah. Let's start innovating on top. And that really got me, okay, now the head's exploding. I've got all these ideas with identity. So my first question to Craig in terms of, right, this is something I really believe in. This is my background. What do you want me to focus on?
When was this question? When did you pose this question?
This is probably early 2018, maybe February, March.
Okay.
What other things that you guys at nChain, what's in the pipeline of things that you guys are going to be working on, tied in with intellectual property, that you want me to focus on that's not being looked at yet? And he originally said logistics and tracking. So I started looking at the Internet of Things protocols. I started looking at how that could be put into wallet systems, and then it all came back down to identity again. So how do you do this? And you connect the identity, because I tend to use the word entity instead of identity, because talking about people, the tracking of people, movements, and the authentication of what people are doing is too short-sighted. I'm thinking sensors, actuators, tracking, logistics, parcels, air traffic control systems, how through that logistics supply chain does me giving you something and you having to hand it somewhere, where do I hand, how do you automate the accountability of what happens to that item? It can be a physical parcel, it could be intellectual property, it can be distributed music, it can be production of something digital, it could be a movie, it could be different people creating different parts of a song, or the production of music, or the production, or it could be AR, it could be virtual reality, it could be any of these things, it could be something like crypto fights. All the people, how do you monetize that, and how do people get paid without having to do more than one contract? How do you tokenize that system and get everything paid, and how do you monitor it, and how do you make sure that every single step is tracked and followed and is registered on the blockchain for one single source of truth? So I started looking at these, and this kind of opened up most of the reasons for the development of Veribit. So I thought as in verification, is the first thing we need to do. The biggest problems we have now, if you are a company or a business and you are in fintech, you need to be financially registered in some way. So in the UK, it's the FCA. If you are a company that are FCA regulated, it's very, very difficult to migrate your business and your services and your accountancy systems to Bitcoin today in a way that would be economically viable. Yeah. So if you can solve those systems now, you open up the whole gateway. If you can fix the plumbing for doing that second layer stuff, so we start doing attestation, revocation, so that regulators can have a really soft touch, hands-on approach without knowing what's going on. Everything can be done at source. You can do taxation at source, and it can be done in such a way that you can do borderless systems, you can do control systems, you can do tracking of vehicles. All of this stuff can be done on chain now, far cheaper and far more, without the infrastructure systems there. Recently, some of the projects I've done, I did I did the works for Edinburgh Airport. So all of the air traffic control systems that come up on the arrivals boards and everything, those systems I worked on. I did all the enterprise architecture stuff for that. Roads Traffic England. So all of the big gantry signs that you see on all the motorways, all of that, that's a £30 million a year government subsidized system. I can make that same system work on Bitcoin today 2 magnitudes cheaper.
How far off do you see this with Veribit?
Different Veribit systems, it's 90% there in terms of the identity system. So some of the things now, so the exchange systems that we're looking at now, so we're looking at being able to supply and support BSV token marketplace and ecosystem. So one of the things you have to do is you've got tokenized, you've got run tokens, you've got Bitcoin Compute, you've got stats tokens. How do you then create a way that they are hot swappable? You can do atomic swaps natively, and you're now thinking, okay, I've heard this before. I know that nChain have patents on atomic swaps as long as it's on BSV. So looking into licensing, looking into patents, we're also looking at developing our own patent systems as well for some of the other wallet systems, second layer stuff.
How's that aspect been with nChain? So nChain and Craig has quite publicly stated more than one occasion that if you're building an SV, you have free reign on license access, right? So if they've got these patents on atomic swaps, your engagement with nChain, has it always been that frictionless pledge and promise, or is it stump up time?
I think a lot of the necessary infrastructure, the MetaNet enabling levels from some of the early IP stuff is certainly being offered within the SDK for free. So within the Nakasendo, the original SDK for developing things like the BSV libraries and stuff like that, they are all free to use, I believe.
Nakasendo was a few years ago, right? I mean, they haven't updated that recently, have they? Yeah.
No, I mean, there are various versions of different libraries. I know, so I was referencing the BSV wallet system libraries via Moneybutton. They were the maintainers for a long time. Now it's Tal and maintaining that. There are other people maintaining different versions depending on the types of applications you're building. So if you're doing JavaScript only, you probably do a different Node JS reference somewhere else. So I know there's different people in the UK working on stuff that are doing it on different languages. So there's a lot out there, but it's now standardizing these things in wallets. So before tokens can be omnipresent and hot swappable between any wallet, if you can take your identity with you, why would you not have an application sign into your wallet rather than have lots of wallet systems sign into?
It makes so much sense.
Makes more sense.
Yeah.
And you can also connect things. So again, when I'm talking about those derivation things, the very first level within the derivation key is actually coin type, and it's 1 or 0. And the 0 is the primary, which is the Bitcoin mainnet, and the 1 is the Bitcoin testnet. So if you look at how STM works, they've actually had to create another layer that creates that as a number 2, which is the STN layer. So if you've got a different token system, you can actually point that system to a contract which says this is how this system is designed to work as a protocol, and you can say that the tokenized protocol is now layer 4 or layer 3, and the run protocol is layer this. So you can have these token protocols within one wallet system. So that makes everything a universal wallet system.
That will be freaking awesome. That will resolve a lot of the problems and a lot of the divides I see happening in the BSV space right now. It seems like the token protocol and the token party has got some people liking hip hop, some people liking R&B. And you've got the techno lot on the other side. But what you're saying there, that could just bring everyone back into resonance and harmony.
Yes, so that first level there is your token area. It can be used, or you can have an application that will overwrite and extend the Ep.44 wallet protocol for HD keys. Yeah. So you can actually create an XPub wallet specifically for application signing. So you can sign in as an application, but you can also assign coin types, but you can also assign address types too. So you can actually have an app as a connected system. And if you're verified with your identity on one, you can actually connect two apps together without providing any third-party information on identity. All you're saying is this identity has been verified. And if you need to authenticate that for something that requires authentication to another business and service, you do that peer-to-peer. You don't require, most of these things can actually be wallet-based events that don't require Bitcoin to do the authentication. The authentication is linked to a transaction within the wallet system. So it can be private and it can be offline.
Nice. Roy, there's something that I've got written down here that I've been saving, okay? Bitcoin carrier wave technology.
Right.
What do you mean by that? Where's your head going? Explain that one for me.
Okay, this is one that lots of people have asked me to write about, and I've started creating a Medium post to kind of explain some of these concepts. One of the hardest things is to take a topology of how things work in my head and translate that to paper or translate it audibly for people to understand.
Oh, dude, if you work that one out, you better give me that piece of software or hardware.
Yeah.
I got that same problem. Just want to say my solutions are PA.
Unfortunately, my wife is my PA, and for now nearly 12 years, in 3 weeks' time, it'll be nearly 12 years, she's had to listen to me
amazing.
obsess about Bitcoin. And because I live in a bubble of, I'll give you an example. Where I live near Silverstone, there are 300 houses within a 300 square mile radius.
Wow.
So I have to walk a mile
Country
and a half.
bumpkin.
So we're in the middle of nowhere. So I don't get to see or talk or interact with anybody. I just focus on everything I'm doing here at home. So I wrote this book called Inhomogeneous Anisotropic Electromotive Force.
Okay.
And the key word there
it's a tongue twister.
Yeah, it's anisotropic. So anisotropy, it's the lattice work within a system where, depending on where you view from, how information is processed. So give you an example, magnets. If you have a rare earth magnet, when the iron oxide within that system came and bubbled up, it actually aligned, because it was magnetized by the Earth's core, it was polarized in one direction. So when you take that, what you do is you create these magnetic things that are these atoms are either ionizing or they're fluxing around lattices. So if you have a magnet on a piece of paper and you drop some iron filings, it will create this kind of butt-shaped approach. It will create a peach shape.
A torus.
A torus. Yeah. Well, a torus, again, if you look from above, if you're looking at through the plane, is actually a donut. So it's not really a torus. It's actually, if you look at it in 3 dimensions, it's a shape. So this is where we're starting to get into the realms now of where you're talking about the golden numbers, the 3, 6s and 9s, the ratios of how these things work in 3-dimensional space. So one of my things within that paper, so I was talking about field theory, and the field theory, if you look at it on 2 dimensions on a piece of paper, you have that torus shape. And it's talking about the reactions of how we measure within a closed loop system, which most systems that we measure, especially with electronics, they're actually in 2-dimensional boards. So if you look at things like watt meters and amp meters, what they are measuring in a 2-dimensional system are the peaks and troughs. They're the waves within the system. And it's the mean average of the peak of the wave and the bottom of the wave, which is where you get the resonance coming through. So what they're doing is they're measuring a 3-dimensional thing in 2 dimensions.
2D. Yeah.
So if you're looking at the economies of how electronic motors work, for example, they work in 3 dimensions, and so do the waves and fields that go around them. So you have this thing called electromotive force, which is that twisting motion. So a motor generator is called a motor generator because if you putting a current through it, it will become a motor. And if you are then making a twisting force, the same action can actually create electricity at the other end. So it's a generator as well. It's a dipole system. So if you're putting energy in, you can store energy or create a twisting force. But you also have a bucking trend, which are the internal frequencies and bucking fields of electromagnetism within the stator winding. So I was looking at ways of creating hyper efficiencies in electric motors by taking away that force, and researching what Tesla was doing 110 years ago.
Yeah.
I think he'd figured it out with his, he actually had a resonator coil, which was the third coil, where it was taking the power out and then feeding it back in at the right phase. So it was phasing in with its own impedance. And it sounds counterintuitive. What they were doing is the turning force between one phase had the power coming through, and then they were switching the power so that you wouldn't have the counter electromotive force going the other way. So you actually had a free winding clock cycle. And that information, if you look at the energy output and you do it in the traditional way of measuring amps and watts with an amp meter and a watt meter, it seems to portray that there's more energy coming out than going in. And you go, okay, well, the second law of thermodynamics doesn't allow for an over unity machine. That makes these assumptions that they're not working in 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions.
So I think a good example of that, just so people could visualize something. Rodent coil, right? Just by using shape power, geometric structure, the torus. Little in, and you actually get more out just from geometric structure of how the winding is done, right?
So I think when we measure things like watts and amps, what we're doing, and this is where, going back to your question about my data carrier on Bitcoin, is when you're looking at wave structures, there's a thing in particle physics where they're not quite sure if you're talking, the maths actually describes particles or if it's describing fields or waves. Depending on the math that you do, it can be both particle and a wave, because of the way these anisotropic viewpoints of where you look at it from. I'm trying to make this in a way that's easily to comprehend for your listeners. If you take something that is cyclotronic, so if you have a pathway, so I'm looking at the camera now, and there's a link between me and you. If you look at a wave face on, you have this wave, you have this attack vector. So you have the attack, the decay, you have wavelength, you have modulation, and you have amplitude. But what's happening in those ups and downs is you're looking at a 2-dimensional cross section of something that is actually, as I'm looking at you, coming towards you and going around something with a spiral. So it's actually corkscrewing, and you're actually viewing something. You're using 2 dimensions. So what you're measuring is if it was an engine, the top dead center and the bottom dead center, you're taking the outputs, the mean outputs from the top and bottom. You're not taking the total energy in that cyclical 3-dimensional system. So that bucking of the trends with the highly efficient motor systems that I was describing in that paper took into account the things. Ammeters and watt meters were designed before the nuclear age, so they had to look at everything as either particles or waves. They weren't thinking 3 dimensions because they were measuring in 2. Circuit boards are 2-dimensional. If you can monitor the power outputs in 3 dimensions, which we don't have any tools for, but you can certainly calculate it, that then makes up for so you've got spin, angular momentum, you have vortex, angular momentum. If you add a spinning top or a snooker ball or a pool ball and you hit the other ball and that ball's spinning, it will kick off in another direction. These things that don't have mass create mass when they touch another object, another massless object. They actually have an equal and opposite, and they create a small force. And if you do that with anisotropic fields, you actually create twisting forces that are not accounted for within engineering systems in 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional mechanical systems. If you can take that into effect and use proper switching.
What would you identify that twisting force to be? Because that twisting force knows how to arrange a dodecahedron in order to build aminos that then build proteins and then create life, right? What a cell knows to fuck with one cell and repel another cell?
There's two different things. So if you talk about biology, it's very different to something like a magnet. So if you look at magnetocrystalline structures, so you have conflux, they're called conflux areas of magnitude. So the conflux area is what creates that weird shape. The further away from the strength of the magnetic field, it creates more entropy the further you get away, which is why it looks on paper, when you do it in 2 dimensions, as a field. Mm-hmm. It's all to do with fractal geometry, which takes us again back to Bitcoin. I'll tell you the reason why they're kind of tied. If you understand the ionization and lattices within structural systems, you can also understand spin angular momentum. So when you say, where does that twisting force come from? It comes from electrons and atoms. They're not in stasis, they're moving. They actually have effects, cause and effect. So this is where people don't tend to understand some of these advanced physics things. So if you're looking at an anisotropic line of view, so if you take something like, these are now debated as do they exist, but take something like scalar waves. Scalar waves have been described as a point-to-point connection between the fabric of space and time. So if you can imagine something like a garden hose, and you filled it full of marbles from front to end, and you excuse for 1 second that there's no internal friction. If you had a spare marble that wouldn't fit in there, imagine that is now 10 miles long, and you popped a marble in this end, it would instantaneously, another marble appear at the other end. So when you have electrons running down a conductor, it's not the electron starting at this end, it's all the marbles stuck together, pushing them out the other end. So when you look at instantaneous transportation of information from one point to the other, if you understand physics in more than 3 dimensions, you can understand that there are different velocities, and there are different forms and different fields and different particles having different interactions or non-interactions. Some of them will pass through our 3 dimensions of space and time. So they're not inhibited. There's no fluxing inhibitor in the speed.
I completely agree with that, because a whole reality is a composition of atoms, right? Which we all know 99.9999% space. And this has always been my issue with mainstream academia and conventional academia, is that everything seems to be an analysis of the 0.0001% then within the visible light spectrum, which is such a tiny bit of information that we are claiming we know all from. And then when you're speaking on what you're speaking on now, this to me is the 99.99 aspect, the vast majority of the information that is there, but somehow in society we just don't pay attention to. That's always dumbfounded me.
I think the reason why is they teach children the wrong kind of geometry. They teach Euclidean geometry. So if you tell a kid, a 3-year-old, to draw a tree, what will they draw? They'll draw a brown rectangle at the bottom and a triangle on top and colour it in green. That's how children build 3-dimensional looking shapes. And then we get a little bit older and they think, okay, it's not a rectangle. It's actually it's a cylinder with a cone on top. So you draw a 3-dimensional tree with a cone. And nature doesn't work like that. It uses fractal geometry to create things. So if you look at, you got 2 dimensions, you got circles and triangles and squares, and then you have 3 dimensions, you have your spheres and your cubes. I'll give you an example of a partial dimension that people can understand. So if you have a piece of paper and you get a biro and you stick a dot in the middle of the page, that dot, if you look at it from a macro perspective and you're not looking at it as a dimensional thing, that's 1-dimensional. If you take that piece of paper, that A4 piece of paper, and you don't take into consideration the thickness of that paper, you'd say that's 2 dimensions. It has length and it has breadth. If you then take that piece of paper and roll it up into a ball, you've now created a 3-dimension from the perspective of your viewpoint, but not from the perspective of the piece of paper. So if you then had that ball of paper and you cut that ball of paper in half, From a distance, and I showed it to you in 2 dimensions on this 2-dimensional screen that you're watching now, it will look like a semicircle. And if I show you side on, you will see it's a hemisphere.
Yeah.
But again, from the perspective of that piece of paper, if you look where you've cut that ball of piece of paper, it's waves and curves all the way through. It's like when you cut a cabbage in half and you look at all the little wavy lines. That is somewhere from the perspective of that second dimension piece of paper. That is actually a partial dimension because it's folded in on itself.
Then when you factor yourself into that equation, perception is everything, right? Feedback loop is everything. Everything is interacting with everything. And then going back to wave and particle, when you really get into, I guess, the quantum scale and quantum level, I guess this is why conventional physics just couldn't ascertain or reason with why you can't observe an experiment because of that.
That's a really good example. So I gave you the child with a tree, drawing a tree. And if you look at the fractal nature of a tree or a plant, give you an example. Look at broccoli. It's the tree structure that has flowers on the end that are not produced. And then if you take something like the cross between a broccoli and a cauliflower is Romanesco broccoli. If you ever see it in the supermarket, it has those wonderful sweeping patterns. So what you've got is sequential fractal loops. That's where we get the snowflake from. So what you do is you have, if you look at that as nature emulating crystalline forms, if you want to know what's going on there on a biological level, these arcs, curves, randomness, and sometimes these randomness creates these sequential fractal loops. We have that in Bitcoin. So if you look at the SECP 256K1, which is the actual algorithm for ECDSA, for elliptic curve digital signatures in Bitcoin, if you boil it down to the very, very simple equation, and I'll draw it for you in space. This is how complex Bitcoin is. If you start there, it's that. Spooky stuff. And if you do that as an algorithm, it's y squared equals 3x plus 7. That's all it is. It's not magic. It's not, people say, these hashing is not a cryptographic function of Bitcoin at all. So it uses something called a Galois field. It's part of the hexadecimal representation of finite field modulus. So it uses something called P equals 2 to the power of 256 minus 2 to the power of 32 minus 977 is the variation of that equation that Bitcoin uses for its elliptic curve system. So you can actually input and feed those systems back into each other to actually create different outputs. So those functions, they are econometrics of mean distribution tools. So what I mean by that is you look at the retargeting of the difficulty in Bitcoin. That is an econometrics mean distribution tool. That is the function that has. It creates whatever hash powers within Bitcoin, it tries to emulate that within 10 minutes. Most people can understand that, but these BTC guys seem to think that it's a function of security and hashing. Everyone has to hash stuff. It's the quantitative relationship between time and energy. Which we call work. And that's the value that's inside Bitcoin. It's not me giving you something. I can create a system where I can give you something for free. It's the validation process of me being able to peer transact with you, borderless, on a system where everybody can tell me and validate well, not everybody validates, but every node within the system can validate that. So I'll give you an example. When I was doing work on database systems years ago, I could tell you the name of a really big UK company that I did some enterprise architecture for, probably 2005, 2006, and it would blow you away. They were keeping login names, username systems, login email addresses and passwords in plain text. And they had a really good guy who was their systems administrator there. And I'm saying, guys, you cannot do this. And he go, okay, we'll hash it first. And I said, and then what? Oh no, the hashing's fine because it's secure. So I came in, logged in, and I said, have you ever heard of rainbow tables? And I said, this is an automated function of going through all the different rainbow tables of elliptic curves that are used in every single hashing function, and basically smashing the hell out of these computers until they let you in.
Yeah.
I said, no, you need to do something called salting, and you went through the process of making it secure.
What do you want the end effect to be, right? What's the end effect? If you crack this, you're more, I guess, aspirational intent. What's the end effect?
Okay. Do you remember CFAX or teletext as a kid?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was invented in 1971. The protocol was invented in 71. CFAX for BBC came out in 1974. I think what was the other one called? Oracle on ITV, when there was only 3 channels in the UK.
I remember teletext. Teletext I remember.
Yeah.
Like growing up at my grandparents. Yeah.
Well, teletext was either the BBC or the ITV, and you had CFAX on one and one on the other. So they were systems that used. It was a data system for channeling Oracle systems or data represented systems through a clear text thing that happened on certain TVs that were specially modified. And it used to use the blanking systems of, you used to get, when you used to tune a television, when they were analog, you used to tune it in, you used to get the flickering. And that was if you had 50 or 60 hertz, depending on if you're in the North America or the UK, which is the hertz is the frequency of the electricity coming through the systems that power the TV. You had to get the blanking to fit, to match, and then the flickering would stop. So you had a blanking system. It's called a V-blank. And within the header of that V-blank, this was all sent via terrestrial television over air, information that would today be on the internet. And you had your remote control and you could log in, you could catch the news, the weather, the sports for your location. And it was an information system that was free on the carrier wave of your television signal. And this was going down coaxial cables from 1950s, 1940s technology. It was providing a metadata layer on top of TV. So I've figured out a way. So if you look at what else has curves and waves as a free-to-air frequency, you have radio, you got television, smartphones, internets. It's all two-dimensional data because it's all peaks and troughs.
Yeah.
You can now transfer. So if you look at how radio works, for example, you got frequency modulation. So say I'm broadcasting at 102.3 2CR FM. So if you're on that frequency, the modulation of that frequency is to do the reverse of the frequency. So to take out the carrier wave, and the difference is you're left with the signal, which can be video or audio. So it's a way of transmitting data across vast distances, as long as you have enough transmitting power. So you can do that with Bitcoin. And I'll tell you why. Because of the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm that I mentioned to you earlier, if you take that curve and you pulled that and you did the reverse of that curve, you then create a frequency modulated wave. And if in the payload of that information, you can create a transaction which mix with the creation of the block, or even mix with the creation of the next transaction if it's streaming data, for example. If you put that into your BCAP protocol, and we've already got these on chain and they're already working, which is part of what Big Block Testers was designed for, you can then use data, hashed data, or the digest of real live streaming data to create a second channel of metadata that goes with it. And that carrier wave is free because you're not paying for Bitcoin miners to host it.
That's interesting.
Say I'm doing a streaming channel. Say you're watching Formula One and you want to watch the race. You sign in with your wallet. You pay for everything and on a pay per second microtransaction via your wallet. But say you want to watch Lewis Hamilton drive in his car, you want to change the camera viewing angle. So what if you're broadcasting every single viewing angle in that stream via Bitcoin transactions, and you then get to choose the story that you watch? So you can now tune in. So now you can go to Formula1.com and you can tune in if you've got Sky, and you can select a certain car you want to watch, or you can listen to certain channels over the radio.
Yeah.
You can now do that as a native within a very small payload or a free payload within the transaction to actually, as a data carrier wave, use the algorithms of ECDSA to actually provide supplemental data in Bitcoin streaming transactions.
That's very
So what would
interesting.
that mean? Imagine you're watching live sports and you wanted to know what was on the other channel. Imagine the Prime Minister or the President is making a speech live. You could have every single AI transaction as whatever language default you've made in your wallet. You can actually do that in real time and do translation subtitles. There are so many different areas, and it doesn't require any more work.
Yeah. No, as you're speaking, my brain's just going. Yeah, that's brilliant. I've never heard of an idea like that with Bitcoin. That's very unique. That's real interesting. Real interesting.
But instead of two-dimensional ways, if you look at how DNA works, there are people spending vast amounts of money now looking at the economies of storage inside genetically modified DNA, because they're saying that biological structures are much better at storing information. So our brains, for instance. Absolutely. I remember the video you did with Lucas from Anne, that awareness neural. So Lucas is working with Bitcoin as a database, but in 3 dimensions. So you take an information here, and you're making a hypergraph of information of how these things are related to each other. You can now do that as a streaming signal in Bitcoin. So if you imagine 3-dimensional structures, remember I told you about that cyclical cyclotron of information. If you're using Bitcoin ECDSA, you don't just have the x-axis and the y-axis and the variables and the attack and the wavelength. You can actually calculate the z-axis as well. So you can compress data into a 3-dimensional waveform that is a cyclotron. So if you have a piece of rope and you twist that rope, the rope will get smaller and smaller, and it will curl up into you will get the most surface area available the tighter you twist it, which is why our DNA is a double helix of information. It uses that fractal geometry to contain data in 3 dimensions. Our brains are built the same and our DNA is built the same. Everything that is organic, you can use that same system. Even if you have a string of data and it's in a blockchain, you can actually use the carrier wave of compressed information. So if whatever you could do with teletext on the internet today would be 1,000 times, 2 orders of magnitude more powerful. Teletext stopped, I think, in 2012 because the internet was just so popular. If you did the same, if you came up with a new protocol for doing teletext in 2 dimensions today, it would be as good as any web page would be today, and as fast. Terrestrially, without any telephone line, without any contracts for internet. You could do it today free for air. It wouldn't be free for air because the internet service providers don't want you to have free. There's no real reason for you to have a landline telephone anymore, apart from the fact that the people that own the line want to lease it to you for £10 a month, and then your telephone bill on top, and then your internet bill, and then your broadband, and then your Netflix. They want to layer the value they gain out of the networks that they create. So they wouldn't want this in a free-to-air system because you're getting free data, and it will change their business models. But you can do this on Bitcoin, and it's not really free data. It's a carrier wave. It's a supplementary metadata, really essential metadata, so you can have channels in streaming information. That's really important, I think, for wallet systems and for people building new things. They're thinking too small. They're thinking NFCs. They're thinking tokens. Many things that people haven't done. So I'm starting to integrate some of this thinking now. How do you reference that? So you've got binary versus a quaternary system in terms of DNA. So instead of ones and zeros, you have A, T, G, and C. So you have more. So instead of a 32-bit system, you actually have a 256-bit system. So you think how many times better that is as a data storage system However, biology is an analog system, whereas Bitcoin can be a purely high fidelity system where you don't have errors. So it's a digital system. So instead of going down the binary route, you can now piggyback off of the back of Bitcoin transactions to actually create data flows. And there's no reason why it can't be over the air. There's no reason why you need to be connected.
So it sounds like we have the best ahead of us, right?
There are so many avenues, so many tangents. I'm going to be playing with this. I actually said in an email to Craig in 2018, really early, Craig, I didn't want his approval. I wanted to say, this is where I stand. This is what I want to achieve. And I am going to spend the rest of my working life dedicated to solving this problem, because not for the money, not for the accolades. It's because it is something that is exciting enough. There's so many things. It's like it's pre-Bitcoin, pre-dot-com bubble in terms of the amount of things you can do. I can give away 100 ideas because I can't monetize them all. And those 100 ideas have another 100 ideas inside them. There's enough for people to be able to innovate upon the remainder of their working lives, if Bitcoin is allowed to scale, if we are allowed to have one system. It's unbounded in so many different ways. I think the message of today is we haven't even scratched the surface of what's possible.
I couldn't agree more.
You've got chimps. You've got chimps playing Pong at the moment. I think they're focusing their things on the wrong way. We can be making our lives easier by making the economies of scale work for everybody on the planet. Everybody on the planet.
Well, I think what Bitcoin is it's slapped down on the planet as a monolithic structure.
Yes.
And the primates touched it and got some of the benefits, kept it for themselves, didn't want the world to know the rest of the benefits. But the beautiful thread that's been sewing through this conversation is one of a feedback loop and the importance of feedback loops and how that builds self-organizing structures. And we really do have an opportunity here of the system of contributionism where we can actually build this new self-organizing structure with Bitcoin and have an absolutely new humanity. And I just want to say from my standpoint, I would love to have another conversation with you, Roy, but I just want to thank you for supporting this project for as long as you have, for suiting up for as long as you have, and not getting too deterred, because I can't imagine it's been very easy, Roy, to keep fighting and to keep those machines on.
There has been some real tough times. There were times probably in 2018 with the last big crash of the whole markets, where I actually wondered, is being someone online who is a presence and an influencer in some ways, is it worth the effort? Am I getting enough out of it? Am I inspiring enough people doing what I'm doing? So I knew that the trolling would go away because people fall into little bubbles and little camps. And I knew the reasons behind it enough for it not to bother me. But when it starts to bother people in your family, you have to kind of step back and say, okay, hold on. What is important in life? What do I really want to focus on? So I actually stepped back for a number of months where I thought, okay, I need to change track. I need to forget every single altcoin I've ever looked at and played with. It's been a real eye-opener over the years to play with these different systems, because I really get to, because of the nature of how I look at things, I go really in depth in picking those systems apart. And I have not found one other system that beats the original Bitcoin protocol. Doesn't even come close.
I agree, bro. Well, you look at it from a mathematical standpoint, everything else looks like Quasimodo.
Yeah.
Right? Bitcoin's got harmony and everything else looks like fucking Quasimodo.
It's true. It's a strange analogy, but it's really true, because when you understand, when you have your eyes open and you step away from the narratives that have been painted and are propagated throughout media, when you can understand even just 10% of how it works is such an eye-opener. I've played around with mining systems, with pool systems, with wallet systems. I've played with nearly all of the different essential parts of Bitcoin, and I've seen other ways of other people doing it. I even went through the whole merge mining thing in 2010, thinking that was a good idea, not understanding at that time the power of scripting, the way that you can have a blockchain stacking system. It's really interesting to know when you have that eye-opening moment that, wow, I'm going to be busy for the rest of my life building this stuff, and I'm not going to scratch the surface. I don't feel like there's any competition for me. I'm going to be focused on what I'm doing. And as long as everybody else puts in the same energy, there is enough pie to go around and feed everybody. And that's what gets me up every morning. That's why I'm so excited about everything I do every day.
Same. Are you going to be at CoinGeek?
If I can, yes, I will. If we are not travel limited, I'd love to go.
Definitely. That's such a hit and miss. I'm hoping the same, that it's going to be a physical thing, and I can jump on a plane without having 10 needles put into me. Then I'll definitely be there. And if you're going to be there, brother, I'd love to see you there. Do you want to sound out with the easiest way for people to contact you? So obviously you've got your Twitter, but what's the easiest way for people to contact you, and about Veribit as well?
Well, I'm always online in Twitter. So if it's personal related, you want to touch base, it'll be Twitter at Murphsicles. If it's anything to do with enterprise scaling on chain, you can probably get hold of me at Big Block Testers on Twitter, which is primarily to set up and interact with the scaling test network, and to provide a pathway for enterprises to step up and start testing applications on chain. If you want to contact me at Veribit, you can contact us at inquiries@veribit.io. That's probably the best way to get hold of me.
Awesome. Roy, my brother, again, I just want to thank you so much. So Roy, Dr. Roy Murphy, one of the first commercial miners ever on Bitcoin, and still rocking and rolling, going, and with the right team, holding that torch of light. Roy, appreciate you, brother.
Michael, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. As always, as you say, peace, love, and light. Thank you so much.
Peace, love, and light. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Hello, beautiful people. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Roy Murphy. And if you did, please ensure you like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really, really enjoyed this episode somehow first prior to watching episode 1, then I definitely suggest you go back and check out the first episode. And if you want to understand some further context around Genesis, history of Bitcoin, then why don't you check out none other than my podcast with the founder and inventor and creator of Bitcoin, none other than the angry Aussie, who we call Satoshi Nakamoto. And as always, until the next time, love and light.